me just do an introduction and say
Okay.
welcome. And I am on the East Coast, and right now it's 7:08 Eastern Standard Time. And for you, what time is it there for you?
It's about 8 minutes past 10 in the morning.
Thank you for your participation in conducting another one of these wetland interviews. I enjoy doing them. They've been successful in the past. And if you're ready, I'd like to start with my first question, which would be, how did you start your career in wetland science? Or when you were going through education, how did you choose, if you chose, wetland science as your college path, or that was later in a career? You can tell me a little bit, in other words, tell me a little bit about how you got started with wetland science.
I was interested in ecological science, ecological research at university, and in my fourth year, we had to choose a major project. The forest ecology people were not available that year to take projects, so I was then asked by the university would I do lakes and wetland ecology, and I said yes, and that was the start. As soon as I started to do it, I knew that was where I was going to stay.
I was wondering where you went to undergrad. Where was that?
Uh, I come from Western Australia in the early 1970s when I went to university. University was actually free in Australia at that stage. Otherwise, I would not have been there. We didn't have the family resources to be able to afford the previous fees. So I went to the one university in Western Australia at that time in the city of Perth. There's now, I think, 4 universities in that city, but there was only one then. So I went to undergraduate in Western Australia, obviously on the western coast of Australia. I went to do my PhD on the northeast coast of Australia in James Cook University in Townsville. So I changed from the southwest Mediterranean to the northeast tropical part of Australia.
So in early 1970s, in the 1970s in the United States, there wasn't regulations for wetlands there are today. So can you tell me a little bit about what Australia was like for wetlands and wetland regulations and how that's changed over the decades since you've been involved with wetland science?
We we didn't have any specific regulations for wetlands. We had general nature conservation and wildlife regulation, national parks, etc. But we were following the US lead, in effect, on environmental issues in the 70s with environmental impact assessment, etc. So basically, you could say we were several years behind what was happening in the US. But in Australia, almost all the regulation is done through the states, not through the federal government. So states did it at different times and periods, etc. But it was really down to the state government, and that has developed over the years. We were the first country to join the Ramsar Convention in 1975, and that helped bring more attention to the issue of wetlands across Australia.
Tell me something a little about the early days of Ramsar and how that got started and what your involvement was with Ramsar as it was started.
I first came across Ramsar in 1984 when I went to my first international conference in Europe, in the Czech Republic, as it's now called. There was a conference there, second Intercol conference, in fact, Intercol Wetland Conference. And I came across a person from the Ramsar Secretariat, which was very small at that stage. And that person just interested me in this issue. And he pointed out that Australia had been the first country to sign. I didn't know when I was working in Australia, working on a Ramsar site. I didn't know it was a Ramsar site, even though I was doing wetland work. So with that knowledge, went back to Australia and started to inquire and find out more about it. And then in 1989, I moved to the United Kingdom to work for a group which gave technical advice to the Ramsar Convention. That's so 89, 90 is when really my interest and involvement in Ramsar started as in effect a independent technical advisor. That was formalized in 1993 when the convention formed its technical review panel, scientific and technical review panel, and I was appointed to that by the Australian government, and then I've maintained involvement in that panel under different roles and with different employers for the I said almost 35 years since.
To ask you about Ramsar, and you answered that question very well. And what I think your last date that you had mentioned was up to 1989. Can you talk a little bit about what your career was from that last date that you gave me until present, if that's not too long-winded of a question to be asking?
Well, prior to 1989, I was doing scientific research, going in the field, measuring water quality, vegetation change, etc., working on artificial wetlands or constructed wetlands, we call them as well. From 1990 on, roughly, I got more and more involved in the conservation and the policy for wetland management. Still doing some of the field research, but also through the Ramsar Convention and the Australian government and links with more international projects, looking at policy for wetland management globally, not in single countries. There were site-based issues in countries in India and Africa, for example, and then later in China. Still doing work in Australia, mainly in the north of Australia, the tropical part, but then getting involved in international assessments and drafting or giving policy advice to wetland managers and helping policy makers develop policy.
Experts that I learned from were folks like Mallory Gelbert and Ralph Tyner. They are my mentors, essentially. Who can you tell us that you had as mentors or your professionals, if you will, that you learned from when you were getting started?
One of the main ones was a gentleman called David Mitchell, who came from Zimbabwe, called Rhodesia at the time, to Australia. He was a alien plant or a waterweed specialist, and that covered part of my PhD topic. So he actually marked my thesis and then gave me a job at his institute afterwards. So he was a very influential person in my life. Sadly, yesterday I just went to his memorial service. He died last week, but he had a long and interesting and full life. And we celebrated both his science and his family life, etc. But it's in my respect for this interview that science, that management of aquatic plants, etc., is where I really got that impetus and moved ahead. So that was really one big person in my early life. When I moved to the international scene, at that first conference, international conference in 1984, I met many luminaries of aquatic science or wetland science, and many of them were from the US. Bill Mitch, etc. Dennis Wiggum, Ralph Good. Some of the other people were Wolfgang Jung from Germany, who then worked in South America, in Brazil in particular. So I made these contacts and kept in contact with these, but without the internet, we still kept in contact and learned from their experiences and knowledge and their enthusiasm for wetlands and for supporting younger career people.
Next question for the end or towards the end, but because you already touched on it, what advice or what thoughts do you have if somebody's listening to this as a way to guide the younger audience to studying wetland science?
I find wetland science exciting. So if younger people, you want to be involved in something, I think choose something where you feel excited about and where you want to learn and you want to contribute. And when you do, I mean, some people want to go and do their science and focus on the science narrowly, which is fine. We need good, tight science. There's also a lot of opportunity in through the international areas to get involved in global assessments, get involved in international organizations, where you actually expose yourself to different cultures, different way of looking at wetlands, different way of doing the science even, and different knowledge bases to expand your own mind and to contribute back to those processes. So to me is putting yourself out there, taking on the work, often extra work if you want to put it that way, getting it done and being part of the team.
Specialty is plants and vegetation, botany, or am I misunderstanding that? Or is it something else perhaps?
Now I started off in botany, doing wetland vegetation, and but then moved into nutrient and heavy metal pollution, which in the 1970s in particular were expanding areas of science. We were still trying to find out about those topics. I then moved into more wetland management, which the vegetation is a big part of that, obviously. But you need to understand the hydrology, understand the role of various animals in these ecosystems as well. So I became, from a very narrow base, really, to a wider appreciation of ecology and the interactions between different parts of the ecosystem, which then led to looking at more pressures, including climate change. I can add, I first gave a talk on climate change in 1988 at a scientific conference. Not many people were interested in 1988 in climate change. This is the scientific people. Now we have a lot of people working on climate issues and carbon issues, which we need to. But I picked up this issue of climate change and just kept working with it over the years, both in the policy area, which was probably more difficult than the science, because a lot of policymakers did not want to know about climate change. And in various governments were saying you couldn't even use those words, climate change, in your reports to governments. So but sticking at it, looking at the science and trying to communicate these topics to people was sort of my way through that.
I'm inspired to ask another question that's off topic, so I apologize for that. Off topic in the sense that I was recently doing a literature search for natural wetlands, not constructed wetlands, because that gets a little bit more involved, but natural wetlands, and then, of course, where are you in the world for this question I was curious about, and that is how much nitrogen and phosphorus uptake by the vegetation could potentially occur in a natural wetland. And I asked that question because I do a class at NYU, New York University, called Wetland Design for Water Quality Improvement. So something I'm working on the past couple of weeks with my class is natural wetlands and how much nitrogen and phosphorus removal there is from a natural wetland per acre. Do you have any thought on that? And I do apologize for going off topic, but when I've looked at the research, it seems as though values are scattered all over the place.
There's huge range of values, but I think as part of this, we need to look at the characteristics of the ecosystem itself and not just measure nitrogen or phosphorus in wherever we can. And we've known for a long time that most of the nitrogen and phosphorus is in the sediment in the wetlands, not in the water itself. A lot of our water quality, or most of our water quality measurements obviously are in the water itself. And yet you get highly productive plants in many of these ecosystems, wetland ecosystems, where there's only low concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, but the sediment is full of it. So that the mechanism of how this nutrients move between the plants, the sediment, and the water, I think, is the critical part. But some of the floating plants, salvinia and water hyacinth, for example, they grow very fast. They can survive in low nutrient water and in high nutrient water, and they're still growing fast. So this interaction between the sediment is critical to understand in that one. And I think that's one of the areas we actually could still do more research on. How do the plants pull the nutrients from the water? Some of these plants are free floating. They don't have roots, only have very, very small root mass. How do they get it? How do they get so much nutrient to grow so fast? So from the plant growth, the production in the ecosystem, I think that's still would there's a lot of room for research there still with new techniques and finer techniques. A lot of our techniques in the past, naturally enough, were pretty crude, broad-based analyses. So I think there's a whole area there. If we're looking at water quality itself for human consumption, etc., then obviously we measure the water. We look at the production in the systems, we got to go further.
About going to the UK, and I'm not sure what year you left the UK, but can you pick up on that thread where you were saying you went to the UK, and when you did your work there, how long did you stay there, and finding your path back to where you are now? Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I went to the UK in 1989. I was wanted to do something different, and living in tropical Australia, which I enjoyed, then going to the UK to work on international conservation issues was a big jump, which I was keen to do that. So and I worked there for 3 years, roughly. I did a lot of conservation program training, etc., and planning in parts of Africa, Eastern Africa mainly then, and in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the Iron Curtain, the communist regimes were collapsing around that time. So the whole eastern part of Europe was opening up. There was an opportunity to work with scientists and conservationists in Eastern Europe. A lot of very good science, high quality science level in those countries. And they were keen to have contact with the Western countries. So one of the big projects I did um, was in the Volga Delta, which empties into the Caspian Sea in Russia, and a big conservation project there. And I found that fascinating. And there's big inland delta, a very large delta, a massive river, huge river, and a lot of very good scientists within Russian scientists, for example, who knew a lot about their ecosystems. So that working together and in those systems totally different to the ones I'd worked in before back in Australia. That's where I got interested in doing more internationally. But then lifestyle issues and personal choices came into it. I wanted to go back to Australia to live. I like to travel. I like to be other places. I like to explore other cultures, etc. But my home, is still Australia. That's where I feel, that's who I am basically. So I got a job back in the tropics again in Australia, a different job to what I had before. But and I was there for about 6 months, and they said, "We want you to run a wetland program from this base, based on your experience having worked in Europe and Africa, etc." So I was given this opportunity, and said, "There's half a dozen people here. There's some travel money, etc. Just go and do it anywhere, as long as you do good work." And get more money. Obviously, you have to fund yourself type process. So I was able to, through that, keep my international links and have people visit Australia and some of our people visit outside of Australia to just keep those links going. And that to me is a big part of it. Keep the links. Whenever there's work to be done, put up your hand and do it and finish it. Sometimes it's difficult, mind you, but you got to do the work, not just be there and smile. And I enjoy doing that. And if you go into different wetlands in the back of some of the country, in Africa or the middle of Asia, etc., I found that fascinating to do. I don't know much about North American wetlands, by the way. That's probably one part of the world where I've done least or explored least. I've been to a lot of conferences there, but then I normally have to fly home because it's a long flight from Australia to the US.
Was it that you returned to Australia?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
I was wondering what year it was that you returned to Australia.
I returned in late 1993, so it was about 3.5 years in Europe, and then I came back to Australia. At that stage, I was then appointed to the Ramsar Technical Panel as a representative for the Oceania region. So I maintained a lot of those international links through that Ramsar link. and I was based in Northern Australia up until about 2000, end of 2004, when I decided I needed another change, and I was offered a job at the International Water Management Institute, which had offices in Asia and Africa. I was based in Sri Lanka, but doing projects, basically mentoring and helping younger scientists from the region, from Africa and Asia, to undertake projects, conservation, inventory type work in African and Asian countries. So I was there for 3 years, and I was happy. I had enjoyed that job, but then I was again out of the blue. I was offered a job as a research professor back in Australia, and I wasn't looking for a job, another job. But it's sometimes hard when you leave a country. It's sometimes hard to get the type of job you want back in your own country because you're not there, and there's other people competing for jobs, obviously, who are probably better known locally. And so they had the opportunity. So I thought, well, I wasn't looking for a job, but if I was looking for a job personally, I wanted to live back in Australia while still working out elsewhere, within Australia and elsewhere. So that opportunity came up just out of the blue. Serendipity plays a role in this as well.
Not knowing much about North American wetlands, I don't want to word it that way, but your focus has not been on North American wetlands. I'm born and raised in the United States. My involvement when I teach at NYU, my wetland design for water quality improvement, I talk about jurisdictional wetlands. So I wanted you to comment a little bit about what we see as jurisdictional wetlands that are heavily regulated in the United States, especially in New Jersey. And the rest of the world now looks at wetlands for, or wetland pond for water quality improvement or water treatment. The focus doesn't seem to be on a jurisdictional wetland by definition. So that's a long-winded question, but I just wanted your perspective on the United States heavily regulated now with a jurisdictional wetland versus what's going on in the rest of the world when we talk about wetlands.
There's several sides to this. I'm fascinated by the level of regulation in the US. That's a positive comment there, because the regulations enable you to do things or to move forward. But the other side of it is how good are the regulations? What do they cover and what do they leave out? And I think one of the difficulties of all regulation is that you have to have boundaries or definitions, and then with various agencies, etc., can work within those. You have trouble then working outside of them. And one of the big changes, I think, in our science over my life is we used to work on sites, discrete sites. Now we tend to look at landscapes. We also look at landscapes now. So if you want to work at a landscape scale and manage water across the catchment or watershed into a wetland, does your regulation or your jurisdictional bounds enable you to do that? In many cases, doesn't, because you've got to be in the wet part to work to be in a wetland. One of the issues we face here, more so than many other countries, is that a lot of our wetlands are dry for long periods, not just seasonally or annually, but for decades. Then they flood, huge floods, and then the frogs and the fish and the water plants, they appear. So they're actually still there. So it's still a wetland. It's just that it's not wet all the time. Now, a lot of our jurisdictional regulation issues have trouble with wetlands that are dry because they define it as wet. And you try to explain that to a policymaker or a legal person who doesn't understand the landscape, because they don't work in those areas. I think it often gets missed. Those connections are huge. And the little bit I understand about some of the issues that you face in the US is what is the water of the US, the waters of the US changes, and what is in and what is out of that definition, with the various governments changing that or questioning it. And I understand. So, but to me, if we want to manage a wetland, we have to manage the landscape. Managing land and water is difficult to regulate for because we have different agencies involved, different landowners involved, and it's a big area. Until we can crack that problem, I'm not sure we are going to get on top of the wetland issues. And I don't think the US is any better or worse off than other parts of the world in this. We all face that same problem. We come at it through different levels of regulation.
Touched on a couple of issues related to my next question. In New Jersey, in my area that I study, streams and rivers, the amount of rainfall, and the governor in New Jersey has now given new regulations, passed a law for rainfall quantities to design for stormwater structure, stormwater management, and that by 2100, there's going to be 30% more precipitation that you have to design for in New Jersey. So can you tell me something about your area of the globe, Australia, and what's being talked about?
It's interesting difference here. Under climate change or global change, large parts of Australia, not all of Australia, but large parts of Australia are expected to be drier. So our issue is not how we manage more rain and therefore more runoff or drainage. It's how we can make the best use of the lower level of water we will expect to have and a change in seasonality. So we're not expected to be the same seasonal rainfall patterns that we have across a lot of Australia. That affects our agriculture, not just our urban areas. And so the whole food cycles come in, the whole farming situation, which is already fraught with difficulty because of farmers wanting water for irrigation purposes and taking that from the rivers, which would feed the wetlands, for example. So we're actually facing a situation of how do we conserve water or manage with less water? And we'd actually loved, in many cases, to have more water, but we're not going to have it. But the other one, this is where I think many parts of the world are going to suffer from. We're expecting more extreme events. So not just the regular seasonality that we're used to on average, as we call it, but bigger floods or bigger droughts. And that is, again, just even more difficult to manage through livelihoods, agriculture, food production, urban area, water management. But our infrastructure may not cope with these huge extremes. We'll get massive floods. The dams and the drainage systems won't cope. They don't cope. We actually have already experienced this. Record level flooding or more frequent high level flooding. And I think we've got not just an ecological or a livelihood issue, we've got an infrastructure and engineering issue as well. Now, if we speed up the drainage of water, we take water out of the landscape as well. We put it somewhere else. That could actually contribute to the drying of the wetlands behind as well. And we've had around the world, we've already drained a lot of urban areas, concrete drainage, etc., just to get the water away from the people or the urban areas in particular. We could end up drying the landscape while we're trying to protect it, just through these drainage structures. We've ponded it downstream, but then we need a bigger pond downstream as well, or put it out into the ocean. So I think we're facing a huge challenge, and again, there'll be different solutions and options in different places. There's no one universal outcome to all this because the climate differs around the world. Our landscape's different, and the drainage and the soil interactions and the flow patterns. But we Australia are expecting a lot of difficulties with this. We're having we already have a difficult situation.
The problems in New Jersey is there's more rainfall, so perhaps that's a rich man's problem if you're a wetland scientist. But it's creating havoc for urbanized areas, and New Jersey is very densely populated. So it's going to create problems for flooding into the future. I want to keep on our schedule. I want to stay on time of 30 minutes because that's what we're asked to do. And believe it or not, we're already at 30 minutes. I'll just ask if you have any other closing comments regarding your career, again, inspiring those that might be thinking about what to do for their career. If this interview is about you, not about me, I could think of things to say to inspire young folks that are thinking about a career path. So if you want to just give us a plug for pursuing wetland science in our last minute here, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
I think we really do need to see more younger people involved in wetland science. Just because younger people will inherit the world, this has been said before, and they'll inherit the future. I'd like to see older people, more established people, transferring their knowledge to younger people. But we need the younger people to come in, so we need to make it attractive for them, invite them in. Knowledge, to me, the pursuit of knowledge is an attraction. I like doing it, but you need a job to do it. Most of us do. So opening up the jobs and giving young people opportunities, and then turn that around when the younger people get there. I'd like to see them grasp it and run with it. Take it, show the enthusiasm, do that, and challenge the established views and knowledge around them. And a lot of young people have a lot of advantage with their understanding of new technologies. So how can we make that? They're onto it. They grow up with it. I'd like to see them use it, and us give them the opportunity to use it as well to make the best of it.
Technology, it gives much more access to wetland science and everything that's going on globally. So that would be a plus to help make that connection between the younger generation and using technology to do that. I want to thank
I
you.
just add one more there because I missed, I think, an important point. I partly said at the start, it's also to travel and go to different places and embrace other cultures and ways of doing things, learn from other people in different places.
Thank you very much. And it is a pleasure, my pleasure, to have interviewed you. Thank you.